From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Revolución es sentido del momento histórico.
Revolution is having a sense of the moment. It's change everything that must be changed. It's complete equality and freedom. It's to treat and be treated like a human being. It's emancipating ourselves for ourselves and by our own strength. It's challenging the dominant forces inside and outside the country. It's defending our values at any price.
Cuban revolutionary leader Fidel Castro has died at the age of 90. He survived 11 U.S. presidents and more than 600 assassination attempts, many orchestrated by the CIA. The Cuban government has declared 9 days of national mourning. Today, we spend the hour looking back at Castro's life and legacy.
Our duty is to fight up until the very last minute, even if someone were to say that humanity had only 10 years left. We would have to fight during those 10 years, for our country, for everyone, and for humanity. That cannot wait, but the situation is difficult, more difficult than ever.
We'll host a roundtable discussion with journalist and activist Bill Fletcher, founder of the Black Radical Congress, Peter Kornblue, director of the Cuba Documentation Project, co-author of Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana, and Professor Lou Perez, author of Cuba, Between Reform and Revolution. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Cuban government has declared 9 days of national mourning following the death of Fidel Castro. He died Friday at the age of 90. His death came 60 years to the day after he, his brother Raul, Che Guevara, and 80 others set sail from Mexico in 1956 to begin what became the Cuban Revolution to oust the U.S.-backed Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. Batista fled the island in 1959, and the Castros have led Cuba ever since. The Cuban Revolution would inspire revolutionary efforts across the globe and lead Castro to become one of the archenemies of the United States. It's said he survived over 600 assassination attempts, many orchestrated by the CIA. Across the developing world, Fidel Castro was viewed as a hero who stood up to Washington and offered support for anti-colonial struggles. This is Bolivian President Evo Morales speaking Saturday.
Fidel as a man, Fidel as a brother, a great human being. Fidel as a politician, a great revolutionary. Fidel Castro is a great teacher in principles and values, a teacher of revolutionaries. His fight has not only been for the Cuban people, nor for the people of Latin America. The fight of Fidel has been for the people of the world that fought for freedom.
Selo Hatang of Nelson Mandela Foundation also praised Castro.
To the people of Cuba, your pain is ours. Fidel Castro belonged to you as much as he belonged to us. And we all believe that, we all know that at some point one has to transition to the other world. And I think in his case, he is a proud man, having helped many struggles around the world to achieve freedom.
In a prepared statement, President Obama said, quote, history will record and judge the enormous impact of this singular figure on the people and the world around him. Meanwhile, President-elect Donald Trump tweeted, Fidel Castro is dead, exclamation point. He later described Castro as, quote, a brutal dictator who oppressed his own people for nearly 6 decades. In political news, President-elect Donald Trump is claiming that millions of people illegally voted in the November 8th election, but offered no evidence to support his claim. On Sunday, Trump tweeted, quote, in addition to winning the Electoral College in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally, he said. While Trump did win the Electoral College, Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton's lead in the popular vote has now reached over 2 million and is expected to grow to 2.5 million. On Saturday, Clinton's legal team said it had agreed to participate in a recount of Wisconsin votes after the state's election board approved the effort requested by Green Party candidate Jill Stein. Stein requested the recount after some computer scientists and election lawyers raised the possibility that hacks could have affected the results.
Today, we filed our petition for a recount, a hand recount of the ballots in the presidential race in the state of Wisconsin. So this is very exciting because we are standing up as a grassroots campaign and a grassroots movement. We are standing up for a voting system that we deserve, that we can have confidence in, that has integrity and security, and that we know is not subject to tampering, malfeasance, hacking, and so on. So we're standing up to say that we deserve that in this election and actually in every election.
Donald Trump has tapped conservative billionaire Betsy DeVos to serve as education secretary. DeVos is the former chair of the Michigan Republican Party, a longtime backer of charter schools and vouchers for private and religious schools. American Federation of Teachers President Randy Weingarten criticized the pick. She said, quote, "In nominating DeVos, Trump makes it loud and clear that this education policy will focus on privatizing, defunding, and destroying public education in America," unquote. DeVos's father-in-law is the co-founder of Amway and a longtime supporter of right-wing causes. Her brother is Eric Prince, founder of the mercenary firm Blackwater. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has named South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley as the next U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. The daughter of Indian immigrants, Haley is widely seen as a foreign policy novice. Israel was one of the first countries to welcome her nomination. Last year, Governor Haley became the first governor to sign legislation against the BDS, or Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement, an international campaign to pressure Israel to comply with international law and respect Palestinian rights. This comes as Donald Trump has yet to announce his pick for Secretary of State. Former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney and former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani are said to be in the running. On Sunday, one of Donald Trump's top advisors, Kellyanne Conway, publicly criticized Romney during an appearance on Meet the Press.
People feel betrayed to think that Governor Romney, who went out of his way to question the character and the intellect and the integrity of Donald Trump, now our president-elect, would be given the most significant cabinet post of all, Secretary of State. And that is a decision that only one man can make.
In news from North Dakota, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has announced it plans to close public access to the site of the Standing Rock protest camp on December 5th. For months, Indigenous water protectors have camped out in the area to fight the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline, which would carry crude oil from the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota through South Dakota, Iowa, and Illinois. In a statement Sunday, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers said it had, quote, "no plans for forcible removal," unquote, of protesters, but the agency said anyone who remained would be considered unauthorized and could be subject to various citations. Dave Archambault, the chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, said in a statement the tribe was deeply disappointed by the decision. Meanwhile, Sunday night, musical legends Jackson Browne and Bonnie Raitt performed a benefit concert for the Standing Rock protesters. Jackson Browne made headlines last month when he signed an open letter to Kelsey Warren, CEO of Energy Transfer Partners, which owns the pipeline. Warren also owns a small music label, Music Road Records, which once released a Jackson Browne tribute CD. Browne said, quote, "I do not support the Dakota Access Pipeline. I will be donating all of the money I've received from this album to date, and any money received in the future to the tribe tribes who are opposing the pipeline, unquote. In the press release about the Jackson Browne tribute album, pipeline owner Kelsey Warren wrote, "I don't know of anybody that admires Jackson more than me," unquote. In news from Syria, the United Nations is warning that about 500,000 children are now trapped in besieged areas and are, quote, almost completely cut off from sustained humanitarian aid and basic services. The UN report estimates there are 100,000 trapped children in the rebel-held areas of Aleppo, which witnessed intense fighting over the weekend. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, 2 rebel-held areas of eastern Aleppo have fallen to government forces in what's been described as the biggest defeat for the opposition in Aleppo since 2012. In other news from Syria, the Pentagon's announced the U.S. military has suffered its first combat death in Syria. The military said a special operations forces member was killed by an improvised explosive device in northern Syria on Thursday. With less than 2 months in office, President Obama has quietly moved to expand U.S. military operations in Somalia. According to the New York Times, the administration's decided to deem the militant group al-Shabaab to be part of the armed conflict that Congress authorized after the September 11, 2001 attacks, even though al-Shabaab did not exist as an organization at the time. The move will make it easier for U.S. forces to intensify airstrikes and counterterrorism operations. Israel's announced plans to build 500 new settlement homes in occupied East Jerusalem in violation of international law. It's the first announcement of new settlement construction since the election of Donald Trump, who's claimed all of Jerusalem as part of Israel. Palestinian lawmaker Mustafa Barghouti criticized the move.
The declaration of the establishment of 500 new settlement units is only the beginning of a very dangerous step to legalize and build more than 30,000 new settlement units in the area of Jerusalem. More than that, this Israeli government is planning to legalize and initiate 120 new settlements in addition to the 159 settlements.
And on Thursday, an estimated 1,000 indigenous people and allies gathered at Plymouth Rock, Massachusetts, for the 47th National Day of Mourning. This year's gathering, the largest ever, was held in solidarity with the water protectors at Standing Rock, North Dakota. Speakers included Munaman James, co-leader of the United American Indians of New England.
In the spirit of Crazy Horse, in the spirit of Metacom, and in the spirit of Geronimo, but above all, in spirit of the water protectors at Standing Rock. And rest assured of this, we are not vanishing. We are not conquered. We are as strong as ever.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Today, we spend the hour looking at the life and legacy of the Cuban revolutionary leader and former Cuban president, Fidel Castro. He died Friday at the age of 90. He survived 11 U.S. presidents and more than 600 assassination attempts, many orchestrated by the CIA. The Cuban government has declared 9 days of national mourning. Castro had been in poor health since 2006 and formally ceded power to his younger brother, Raul, in 2008. Fidel Castro died 60 years to the day after he, his brother Raul, Che Guevara, and 80 others set sail from Mexico in 1956 to begin what became the Cuban Revolution, to oust the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. Batista fled Cuba in 1959, and the Castros have led Cuba ever since. The Cuban Revolution would inspire revolutionary efforts across the globe and lead Castro to become one of the archenemies of the United States. This is Fidel Castro addressing his fellow Cubans in the 1980s.
Revolución es sentido del momento histórico.
Revolution is having a sense of the moment. It's change everything that must be changed. It's complete equality and freedom. It's to treat and be treated like a human being. It's emancipating ourselves for ourselves and by our own strength. It's challenging the dominant forces inside and outside the country. It's defending our values at any price.
Fidel Castro embraced communism. He called himself a Marxist-Leninist. Washington repeatedly tried to remove him from power with the ill-fated invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1961 and a decades-long economic embargo. Castro denounced the U.S. blockade of Cuba in the 1988 film The Uncompromising Revolution, directed by Saul Landau and Jack Willis.
Pudiéramos decir que los primeros 10 años
For the first 10 years, the revolution had to survive the blockade and create possibilities of development.
En esos campos,
in these years, basic progress occurred, like eradicating illiteracy, building an educational system, getting schools to remote areas, providing teachers. In those days, we even, quote, improvised teachers because there weren't enough teachers. Plans to train doctors. Of our 6,000 doctors, 3,000 in 1959 were lured to the United States. We have had to face U.S. hostility, the blockade. Great challenges. I think our responses were appropriate.
Across the developing world, Fidel Castro is viewed as a hero who stood up to the United States and assisted Marxist guerrillas and revolutionary governments around the world. In the 1970s, he sent Cuban troops to Angola to support the government over the initial objections of Russia. Cuba helped defeat South African insurgents in Angola and win Namibia's independence from South Africa in 1990, adding pressure on the apartheid regime. After Nelson Mandela was freed from prison in 1990, he repeatedly thanked Fidel Castro. On Saturday, the leader of the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola said Castro was like Mandela.
In the world, from time to time, there will be individuals like this who appear, be it in science or politics. These individuals are like our Mandela, and when they leave us with a gap, emptiness and longing. Because for some, Fidel Castro was a dictator, but for us, he was not. He was a revolutionary. Regardless of anything, he was also a charismatic figure. Even his Western enemies respected him. It's difficult for people like that to exist in today's world. These are rare people. They are geniuses.
Many Cubans who fled the regime consider Castro a tyrant who demanded absolute obedience from the Cuban people through censorship of the media and by imprisoning people he deemed antisocial, including dissidents, artists, and members of the LGBT community. In July 2015, President Obama reestablished formal diplomatic relations with Cuba. After Castro's death was announced Friday, Obama released a statement saying, quote, "We know that this moment fills Cubans in Cuba and in the United States with powerful emotions, recalling the countless ways in which Fidel Castro altered the course of individual lives, families, and of the Cuban nation. History will record and judge the enormous impact of this singular figure on the people and world around him," unquote. Donald Trump tweeted, "Fidel Castro is dead!" exclamation point. In Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau issued a statement that described Castro as larger than life and a remarkable leader, quote, "a legendary revolutionary and orator who made significant improvements to the education and health care of his island nation," unquote. He also noted that his father, Pierre Trudeau, was proud to call Fidel Castro a friend. All of this comes as several major U.S. airlines are beginning commercial flights to Cuba this week. For the first time in 55 years, the first flight is landing today. Today, as we broadcast, that flight is leaving from New York to Cuba. In April of this year, Castro gave what would be his farewell speech. Addressing the closing of a Communist Party Congress in Havana, he defended his record, saying, quote, "Soon I'll be like all the others. The time will come for all of us, but the ideas of the Cuban communists will remain as proof on this planet that if they're worked at with fervor and dignity, they can produce the material and cultural goods that human beings need, and we need to fight without truce to obtain them," unquote. When we come back, we host a roundtable discussion on Fidel Castro's life and legacy. Stay with us.
Siempre que se hace una historia, se habla de un viejo, de un niño o de sí. Pero mi historia es difícil, no voy a hablarles de un hombre común. Haré la historia de un ser de otro mundo, de un animal de galaxia. Es una historia que tiene que ver con el curso de la Vía Láctea. Es una historia enterrada, es sobre un ser de la nada. Nació de una tormenta, en el sol de una noche el penúltimo mes. Fue de planeta en planeta, buscando agua potable. Quizás buscando la vida o buscando la muerte, eso nunca se sabe. Quizás buscando siluetas o algo semejante que
Cuban musician Silvio Rodriguez. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we spend today looking at the life and legacy of the Cuban revolutionary leader Fidel Castro, who died on Friday at the age of 90. We're joined by three guests. Bill Fletcher, Jr. is a longtime labor, racial justice, and international activist, editorial board member and columnist for BlackCommentator.com, founder of the Black Radical Congress. His recent piece headlined Black America and the Passing of Fidel Castro. Peter Kornbluh is also with us, director of the Cuba Documentation Project at the National Security Archive. He's the co-author with William Leogrand of Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. And joining us via Democracy Now! Video stream, Lou Perez, Jr., professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, author of several books, including Cuba and the American Imagination, Metaphor and the Imperial Ethos, and Cuba Between Reform and Revolution. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! Peter Kornbluh, let's begin with you. Your reaction to the death of Fidel Castro.
Well, the world has lost one of the most famous, leading, and dynamic and dramatic revolutionaries who ever lived. He's going to have a very controversial legacy, but it is indisputable that he took a small Caribbean island and transformed it into a major actor on the world stage, far beyond its geographic size. He stood up to the United States. He became the David versus Goliath, withstood all of the efforts to kill him, overthrow him, and that is what he will go down in history for in many ways. Cuba is in a very difficult situation today, in an extraordinary transition in terms of the Cuban leadership and in terms of the leadership in the United States. It's not clear where the relationship between Washington and Havana is going to go under Donald Trump. And in that respect, the death of Fidel now comes at an extremely delicate moment. But you know, the world's going to, I think, remember Fidel as somebody who really stood for independence and sovereignty and brought a great pride and nationalism to the Cuban people.
And Bill Fletcher, your immediate response when you heard that Fidel Castro had died. I mean, he was no longer the actual president. He'd handed over power in 2006 to his younger brother, Raul, who's actually 85, and then formally ceded that power in 2008. So it's been about a decade.
Much as, Amy, as Peter just said, we lost a very audacious leader, an outspoken champion of national liberation, national independence. And while there are, you know, in the mainstream media, many criticisms that are being made of Fidel Castro, and there's certainly legitimate criticisms, what the U.S. media misses is why is it that most of the world mourns his passing. It's not just the mourning of a historic figure, but a figure who actually shook up the planet.
In what way?
He did things that were really, it's just interesting, Amy. He took a country that had been turned into a whorehouse and gambling casino for the United States and gave that country dignity. He turned a country that was poor, remains poor, into a major location for the production of medical personnel who have gone around the world and made themselves available to countries that could never afford that kind of assistance. He, as Peter mentioned, he combated the apartheid regime in South Africa, but in addition provided all sorts of assistance to forces that were fighting Portuguese colonialism and white minority rule. He helped to construct the idea of Latin American independence, working very closely with the late President Chavez of Venezuela. And this is one of the reasons that he has a special place for much of Black America, that he stood up to the United States. The United States did everything that they could possibly do to destroy him, to bring him down and to bring down his government, and it did not work.
Lou Perez, talk about your interest in Fidel Castro and your response to this latest development, the death of Fidel Castro.
Good morning. I think it's important to contextualize Fidel Castro. What resonates in the world, at least as much as Fidel Castro, is the Cuban Revolution. And the Cuban Revolution itself is a historical process that comes out of 100 years of struggle. The Cuban Revolution represents a culmination of Cuban history. And behind Fidel Castro, or perhaps even ahead of Fidel Castro, are a people who have been struggling for self-determination and national sovereignty for the better part of a century. So Fidel Castro happens to be the person who has the capacity to summon and bring to fruition and culmination a long historical process. It happens that this process culminates in the early 60s at the same time that the decolonization of Africa and Southeast Asia and the Middle East is undergoing. And all of a sudden, Cuba becomes emblematic of a global phenomenon, and that probably no country in the world bore the imprint of American domination more than Cuba did in the 20th century. And so that Fidel Castro, with 6 million of the Cubans, assumed the political position of challenging the American presence, of minimizing American influence, of expelling American capital, of breaking diplomatic relations, and then withstanding, as your guests have indicated, 60 years of one failed invasion, years of covert operations, multiple assassinations, and a highly punitive embargo, speaks to the resolve not only of Fidel Castro, but the resolve of the Cuban people.
And Professor Perez, the dominant discussion in the U.S. corporate media is that he was a dictator, that he was a killer, that he killed many and imprisoned dissidents. Your response to that description?
I don't know how to respond to that. I think this is an authoritarian system. This is a system that is not reluctant to use repressive means to maintain power. This is a system that has spawned a fairly extensive intelligence system, surveillance systems. And in many ways, I think Cuba offers us a cautionary tale. For 30, 40, 50 years, Cuba has been under siege from the United States. And once that idea of national security enters into the calculus of governance, you are aware that civil liberties and the freedoms of the press and freedom of political exchange shrink. And we're experiencing this here since 9/11. So that Cuba becomes a national security state with justification if one believes that the duty of a government is to protect the integrity of national sovereignty. And so for 50 years, Cuba, 90 miles away from the world's most powerful country, struggles to maintain its integrity, its national sovereignty, and in the course of these years, increasingly becomes a national security state. Ironically, the United States contributes to the very conditions that it professes to abhor.
Peter Kornblue, you had a chance to meet Fidel Castro. I'd also like you to give us a thumbnail sketch, a biography, if you will, of Fidel Castro, where he was born, what were the influences on his life, and how it was 60 years to the day before he died on Friday. He made that trip, leaving Mexico with Che Guevara and his brother Raul to begin the Cuban Revolution.
Well, I did have the extraordinary opportunity to spend some real time, quality time with Fidel Castro, if you will. We organized two major conferences, one on the 40th anniversary of the Bay of Pigs invasion and one on the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, brought all the surviving Kennedy administration officials to Havana, retired CIA officials, and in the case of the Bay of Pigs invasion, we even brought former members of the CIA-led brigade that had invaded Cuba to sit at a conference room table and discuss this rather extraordinary history with Fidel. And over the course of time, we had 4 private lunches and 2 state dinners, and I was able to kind of sit in front of him and listen to the history that he embodied and that he was a part of, and that he changed with the power of his personality and the force of his leadership. We have lost a historical figure, and with him goes tremendous amount of history that only he knew and only he could share. And so the movies and the books to come, I think, are going to be extremely important for us to evaluate and think more about the history that he helped to make and dominated in many ways over the last 50, 60 years. You know, he was born to a Spanish immigrant who became a major landowner in the provinces of Cuba. He grew up a relatively privileged life. He became a lawyer, and he began to oppose the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista, leading a kind of an overthrow attempt on July 26, 1953, at the Moncada barracks. That's why his movement was called the July 26 movement. That effort failed miserably, and he was thrown in jail. He miraculously was actually released under an amnesty and exiled to Mexico, where, as we know, he organized the Cuban Revolution. He received a lot of credit for sparking the revolution, but as Lou Perez would be the first to say, there was tremendous opposition to Batista in the urban sectors, organized independently of Fidel Castro. But his landing in Cuba on December 2nd, 1956, in the small boat, the Granma, with 88 guerrillas to go into the mountains, started kind of the process going forward in a big way. You know, it was an improbable revolution. The landing party led by Fidel was attacked almost immediately, and he lost the vast majority of his men. Only 12 members of the landing group, the guerrillas that he was bringing to Cuba, survived. And among them, him and Raul and his brother and Che Guevara and just a handful of others. But he, for the force of his personality, managed to broaden the appeal, hook up with the urban revolutionaries and opposition, and bring about this extraordinary revolution. He survived assassination attempts. He might have actually been killed at the Bay of Pigs. He was the members of the brigade had him in their rifle sights. He survived there. He survived the missile crisis, in which the Kennedy administration was almost ready to obliterate Cuba to take out those Soviet missiles. And along the way, he turned his country upside down. There's going to be a lot of debate, and is debate right now, over the legacy of his repression, of his economic decisions. Even he, later in life, acknowledged that the model that he had set forward wasn't successful in the end for Cubans over the long term. But he will be remembered for his emphasis on health care, education, and certainly his uncompromising commitment to independence and sovereignty. And the legacy of his discussions with the United States shows this extraordinary commitment. At one point, the Carter administration sent a secret negotiating team down to talk to him, and they basically said, you know, we'll lift the embargo if you get out of Africa. And he said in response, you know, I don't accept that the United States gets to operate by one set of rules and Cuba, a smaller country, is being told to operate by a second set of rules. The revolution meant independence for our governance and our foreign policy, and that is what we are going to pursue. And he pursued that until the very end.
I wanted to turn to the relationship between Castro and Nelson Mandela, of course, the South African president, imprisoned for decades himself. In 1991, a year after he was freed, and a few years before he became president, Nelson Mandela visited Cuba to thank President Fidel Castro. This is when they first met.
Before we say anything,
Antes de hablar absolutamente de cualquier tema,
you must tell me when you are coming to South
me
Africa.
tiene que decir cuándo viene para Sudáfrica.
You see, no, just a moment, just a moment.
No, un momentito.
Es seguro, si ya yo recibí.
The sooner the better.
And we have had a visit from a wide variety of
Invitado una
people.
gran cantidad de personas.
And our friend Cuba,
Y nuestro amigo Cuba,
which helped us in training our people,
que nos ayudó a entrenar a nuestra gente,
gave us resources to
que nos
get
dio
on with our
recursos,
struggle,
que nos ayudaron tanto en nuestra
trained
lucha,
our people
que
as
entrenó a nuestros
doctors and so
combatientes, a
on.
nuestros médicos.
You have not come to our country.
Cuba no ha venido a visitarnos, usted no ha ido a visitar.
When are you coming?
¿Cuándo viene?
No he visitado a mi patria
I
surafricana.
haven't visited my South African homeland
La
yet.
quiero como una patria.
I love it as a
Quiero por él
homeland.
y por el pueblo.
I love it as a homeland as I love you and the South African people.
That was Nelson Mandela imploring Fidel Castro to come to South Africa. And this is Fidel Castro speaking in South Africa in 1998.
Conviértase Sudáfrica en modelo de un mundo futuro más justo y más humano.
Let South Africa be a model of a more just and more humane future.
Si ustedes pueden, todos podemos.
If you can do it, we will all be able to do it.
That was Fidel Castro speaking in South Africa. And before that, Nelson Mandela, just after he got out of jail, visiting Castro in Cuba to invite him to South Africa. Bill Fletcher, talk about the relationship of Cuba, Fidel Castro, with the continent of Africa and liberation struggles there.
Well, you know, it's interesting, Amy, because there was a special relationship that existed between the Cuban Revolution in Africa from almost the beginning. The Cubans were very supportive of the Algerian struggle against the French, which succeeded in 1962. They went on to support the various anti-colonial movements in Africa, including and particularly the anti-Portuguese movements in Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique. And they were unquestioning in their support for the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. It's the Angolan struggle that receives a lot of attention. And one of the things that was not understood at the time by many of us in the United States, including many of us on the left, was that when Cuban troops went to Angola, they did not go at the behest of the Soviet Union. In fact, the Soviet Union was not in favor of Cuban troops going there. The Cubans went there out of a sense of solidarity. I mean, they actually believed in solidarity. And they went there to stop the invasion that was in the process of taking place by the South African apartheid troops and their allies in the FNLA and UNITA. And so this relationship has been very, very strong. And you could tell in the words of the late President Mandela that this bond, this love for the Cuban people and for the Cuban Revolution, that bond also translated into a feeling in Black America of a certain kind of bond, a certain support for the Cuban Revolution, feeling that this was a revolution that paid attention to Africa, but also paid attention to the struggle around racism within Cuba, although obviously there were certain limitations to that. But I would say that Cuba probably made the greatest advances in the struggle around racism of any country in the Western Hemisphere.
To turn to Cuba's role in Angola, this is a clip from the 2001 documentary Fidel, The Untold Story. That was directed by Estela Bravo. You hear the narrator, Vlas de Vrana, first.
Right from the beginning, Cuba's revolutionary ideals not only spread throughout Latin America, but also forged strong ties with national liberation leaders such as Sékou Touré, Amílcar Cabral, Julius Nyerere, Zamora Machel, and Agostinho Neto.
When the regular South African troops invaded Angola, we couldn't stand by and do nothing. When the MPLA asked for our help, we offered them the help they needed.
In 1975, as Angola moved towards independence from Portugal, the CIA, along with the apartheid government of South Africa, tried to bring down the new Angolan government. At the request of the Angolan president, Fidel sent 36,000 troops to keep the South African forces from attacking Luanda, the capital. For many Cubans, whose ancestors were African slaves, the fight in Angola was a way to repair a debt to history. In 14 years of war, over 300,000 Cubans, doctors, teachers, and engineers, as well as soldiers, played an important role in Angola. More than 2,000 lost their lives. In 1988, Fidel sent in more Cuban troops for the decisive battle at Quito Cuanavale and directed operations from Cuba. The defeat of the South African army drove a large nail into the coffin of apartheid and helped advance the struggle of the South African people.
That's a clip from the 2001 documentary Fidel, The Untold Story, directed by Estela Bravo. Now let's go to the film CIA and Angolan Revolution. In this clip, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger explains why the U.S. was concerned about the Cuban troops that Fidel Castro had sent to fight in Angola. After Kissinger, you hear Fidel Castro himself.
We thought, with respect to Angola, that if the Soviet Union could intervene at such distances from areas that were far from the traditional Russian security concerns, and when Cuban forces could be introduced to distant trouble spots, and if the West could not find a counter to that then the whole international system could be destabilized.
It was a question of globalizing our struggle vis-à-vis the globalized pressures and harassment of the U.S. In this respect, it did not coincide with the Soviet viewpoint. We acted. But without their cooperation. Quite the opposite.
That from the film CIA and the Angolan Revolution, Bill Fletcher, as we wrap up this section on Cuba in Africa.
There's a story that I heard, Amy, about what happened in Angola on the night of independence. And there was panic in the capital. South African troops and their allies were approaching, and no one knew what was going to happen. And then at midnight, people went down to the docks, and out of the darkness came Cuban troops, Cuban ships, that then landed troops. And the look on the face of the person who told me the story, who witnessed this, was something that I'll never forget. That the sense that they had been saved at a critical moment in an act that had not been driven by the Soviet Union, but had been driven by a belief in solidarity and a particular relationship between Cuba and Africa. And that's something that the U.S. mainstream media is completely ignoring at this moment.
And Che Guevara would be in Africa, right, fighting for
Correct.
leading Cuban forces before he would ultimately die in Latin America.
That's correct. He went to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and was fighting a neo-colonial regime that, ironically, he was working with Kabila, Laurent Kabila, in the beginning. But the forces there were very poorly organized. They weren't really ready to carry out a revolution, and the Cuban advisors withdrew ultimately because the conditions were not ripe.
Mm. Speaking about Che, I thought I would turn right now to Che Guevara. I want to turn to another clip from the film Fidel, The Untold Story, directed by Estela Bravo. This is Fidel Castro talking about Che Guevara following his execution in Bolivia in 1967.
Si queremos un modelo de hombre.
If we want a model of a man who belongs not to our time, but to the future,
de corazón digo,
I would say with all my heart that that model is Che.
In 1997, 3 decades after he was killed, Che Guevara's remains were found and returned to Cuba. Fidel Castro talked more about him in the film Fidel.
I dream about him often. I dream that I'm talking to him, that he's alive. It's a very special thing. It's hard to accept the fact that he's dead. Why is that? I'd say it's because he's always present. Always present everywhere.
That from Fidel by Estela Bravo. We're going to go to break and then come back and talk about the effect of Cuba and Fidel Castro and Che Guevara in Latin America. This is Democracy Now! As we look at the life and legacy of Fidel Castro. He died on Friday at the age of 90. Stay with us.
Decirte ni sé explicarme qué pasó, pero de ti me enamoré. Fue una luz que iluminó todo mi ser, tu risa como manantial lleno mi vida de inquietud. Fueron tus ojos o tu boca, fueron tus labios o tu voz, fue a lo mejor la impaciencia de tanto esperar tu llegada, más no sé.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're hosting a roundtable discussion on Fidel Castro, who died Friday at the age of 90. We're speaking with Bill Fletcher, who is the founder of the Black Radical Congress, Peter Kornblue of the Cuba Documentation Project, and Professor Lou Perez, Jr., author of Cuba and the American Imagination, Metaphor and the Imperial Ethos. Professor Lou Perez, Jr., talk about the effect of Fidel Castro in Latin America. We just left this conversation about Che Guevara, his death. Talk about what Che Guevara was doing there, what he was doing for Fidel, and what Fidel Castro was doing in Latin America beyond Cuba.
The power of Fidel Castro in the Cuban Revolution stands as a phenomenon of resisting the American pushback against the Cuban Revolution. That is, in a region that had been repeatedly intervened militarily in Mexico and Central America, political intermeddling, economic intervention in South America. The example of Cuba, especially with the failed invasion of the Bay of Pigs, which contributed powerfully to the consolidation and the centralization of power. And the Cubans celebrated the Bay of Pigs as the first defeat of imperialism in the Americas. And that projection, that boast, that victory, just reverberated across Latin America. And perhaps more than anything else, suggested that a people resolved, the leader resolved with the capacity to resist intervention. Perhaps it was indeed possible. And when the Cubans exhort Latin America to make the Andes the Sierra Maestra of the New World, that idea of being able to affirm autonomy, agency, self-determination, national sovereignty, just resonated across across Latin America. And Che Guevara takes the model of the Cuban guerrilla war, the focal theory, the idea that a small handful of people who inter themselves in the interior, the hinterland of a Latin American country, can create what we call the subjective conditions of revolution. And from that, guerrilla focal would expand a revolutionary movement that would eventually prevail and proclaim victory. The Che Guevara model of revolution essentially is the replication of the Cuban guerrilla war during the 57 and 58.
And talk about what happened with Che Guevara in Bolivia and what that meant to Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution.
Well, the defeat of the guerrilla focal in Bolivia, the capture and the execution of Che Guevara, really dealt a body blow to the whole idea of armed struggle in Latin America. It would not be until the Sandinista victory in 1979 where you do have indeed a triumph of a guerrilla movement. But after the defeat of the guerrilla focal and the death of Che Guevara, the Cubans turned more toward domestic issues. These are the years of the big push for the economy. This is the year of the disastrous 10 million ton crop. And between the death of Che Guevara and the 10 million ton crop of 1970, it's possible to take a look at those set of years as really determining moments that altered the trajectory of the Cuban Revolution.
I wanted to turn to today and the response of the U.S. Leaders. You had President Obama actually tweeting, I believe, after Donald Trump, the president-elect, did. First, he tweeted, Fidel Castro is dead, ! Then condemned the late Cuban leader in a statement issued hours after Castro's death. The statement read, not clear who wrote it or tweeted it, "The world marks the passing of a brutal dictator who oppressed his own people for nearly 6 decades. Fidel Castro's legacy is one of firing squads, theft, unimaginable suffering, poverty, and the denial of fundamental human rights." And then that was Donald Trump. This is Donald Trump's senior advisor, Kellyanne Conway.
We're allowing commercial aircraft there. We pretend that we're actually doing business with the Cuban people now when really we're doing business with the Cuban government and the Cuban military. He's been very clear that the major priority now is to make sure Cubans on Cuba have the same freedoms that Cubans here in America have, which is political, religious, and economic freedom. Make sure those political prisoners are finally released into freedom, and make sure the American fugitives face the law.
So that's Kellyanne Conway. Peter Kornbluh, can you respond to her description and also talk about what this means for today as this all takes place in this period leading into a Donald Trump presidency and what this means?
I can. But let me just follow up on Lou Perez's point by saying a very personal anecdote. When news very early Saturday morning came in that Fidel Castro had died, I spoke to a very special friend of mine from Peru, and she said to me, for most of my life, he was a hero to me for standing up to the United States. and certainly throughout Latin America and much of the Third World, that, I think, was a prevalent thought about Fidel's passing. He stood up to the United States. He gave pride, nationalism, self-determination, sovereignty, independence to Cuba, but also created a model and an aspiration for many other peoples and many other countries in the Third World that had been under the thumb of the United States for many years. You know, we're in a very delicate moment right now with the election of Donald Trump. Trump, in September, went to Miami and tried to garner hardline Cuban-American votes by saying that he was going to rescind and reverse all of the executive orders that Barack Obama had made to move the process of normalization of relations with Cuba forward, and that he would reverse that process unless the Cubans gave in to our demands, gave in to our and made concessions to the United States. And I can tell you from being in Cuba often that the word concession is a true four-letter word in Cuba. It leads to almost an explosive negative reaction, the idea that Cuba would ever make any concessions to the United States. That is the pride they have in the revolution. What Obama has done is not made a bad deal with Cuba. He hasn't made any deal with Cuba at all. He had said to the Cubans, we are going to move forward in the interests of U.S. policy, in the interests of our relations with the rest of Latin America, and in our own interest that we should have a different relationship with you, and we think it's going to have an impact on your society, on your economy, and on your politics over the long term. But we're going to move forward towards normal relations, and you can join us if you want, or if you don't want to, you don't have to. And the Cubans have always wanted normal relations with the United States. The secret, declassified history of Fidel's efforts to reach out to the United States in between speeches denouncing imperialist Yankees is very clear in the book that Bill Leogran and I did, Back Channel to Cuba. Fidel wanted the validation for the Cuban Revolution of having a peaceful coexistence with the United States. And as Lou Perez so importantly pointed out, Cuba preferred not to live in the shadow of the security threat from the Colossus of the North. They would much prefer not to have the threat of U.S. intervention hanging over them, and that's what normal relations would eventually mean to them. And now we have a situation where Trump may want to roll back these great gains that are happening at this very moment with these direct flights to Havana and tens of thousands of Americans going.
Landing as we speak for the first time, direct flight.
This is a dramatic moment, and it's really the moment in which U.S. citizens and the citizens around the world are going to have to really organize to press for a continuation of this very important process of peace and dignity and harmony between the United States and Cuba, which is now being threatened by the position of the incoming President Donald Trump.
And your response to the description of Fidel Castro as a brutal dictator, Peter?
Well, listen, Fidel Castro was an authoritarian. He ruled with an iron fist. There was repression and is repression in Cuba. In Fidel's kind of argument, he did it in the name of a different kind of democracy, a different kind of freedom, the freedom from illness, the freedom from racism, the freedom from social inequality. And Cuba has a lot of very positives that all the other countries that we don't talk about don't have. There isn't gang violence in Cuba. People aren't being slaughtered around the streets by guns every day. When they defeated the Zika virus right away, there is universal health care and universal education. So I mean, this is the debate over the legacy of Fidel Castro.
We're going to have to leave it there, but I thank you so much for being with us, and we'll continue this discussion. Thanks to our guest, Peter Kornbluh, director of the Cuba Documentation Project at the National Security Archive, co-author of Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. Thanks to Lou Perez, professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, author of Cuba, Between Reform and Revolution, and Bill Fletcher, columnist for BlackCommentator.com, founder of the Black Radical Congress. And that does it for our show. I'll be interviewing Bernie Sanders tomorrow on the show. Please send us your questions at stories@democracynow.org, and check out our 20th anniversary celebration December 5th. Check our website, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.